Hey everybody, we're going live now. It's good to see everybody. Anyway, let's get going. We're reviewing some of Reason and Theology's Fatima videos because we just did an interview, which I'll put in the description after the fact, or you can look up. We did an interview with L.A. Marzulli, connecting UFO phenomenon, paranormal in general, with Fatima, which, if that sounds insane, go watch the interview. Go watch some of the other stuff we've done on UFOs. So, without further ado, let's try to get into this. All right. Okay, that's good. If someone is watching and has any comments on our volume, let me know. But anyway, let's go.
You're watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. Your host, Michael, on a Monday evening, joined by Kevin Simmons. We are going to be continuing the webinar, Our Lady of Fatima. I think this is the fourth one. Is that right, Kevin?
What?
Yep.
I'm in the fourth one?
Fourth
this
one.
is the earliest one.
The third on RNT, but I think you did one prior to that.
Yeah, on my YouTube channel.
Yeah, awesome.
Is the audio coming in okay?
Yeah, I can hear you very well.
Okay, good. Yeah, I have the audio. It's hanging from the ceiling now, the microphone. So,
believe it or not, I couldn't tell any difference. I hear it really clearly. So whatever you did, it's working really well.
Okay, good.
But yeah, let's dive in. What we're going to do is watch the webinar video lecture presentation from Kevin, as we've done previously, and then after that we'll have some Q&A. So maybe hold your questions until towards the end. But of course, when you do send them, send it to @Reason and Theology so that I can know that it's a question and not just some comment. So all right, let me go ahead and pull it up.
All right, this is the earliest one of this guy I could find on this channel. So maybe did something on an earlier channel. So, but we will dive in. Hopefully they don't get too deep in the weeds, or I'll just have to abandon this live stream.
Up on my screen here, unless you had some introductory comments that you wanted to make before we show the video.
Yeah, just to kind of maybe just quickly orientate everybody. In the previous webinar, the third one, we discussed the foundations for the advancement of the ideology of communism into the Western world, as well as the agitation that this caused. So in this webinar, I want to continue that discussion, but I want to use it, the date of 1960 from Sister Lucia as a guiding light to kind of indicate to us why this was important, this date of 1960, that she had put on famously on the envelopes containing the third part of The Secret of Fatima. There's a little bit more to it, and I kind of just want to go a little deeper into that while following this theme of the agitation, especially under the umbrella of faith and some of the things that this was going to have. These agitations were going to affect upon faith.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if y'all have any trouble with the.
All right. So it's going to be an interesting live stream, I guess. We don't, as we were talking with L.A. Marzulli, I don't trust, and he doesn't trust. Well, we don't trust the Fatima apparition at all. We don't believe it's the biblical Mary. We don't believe it's of God. We believe there's a bunch of connections to the paranormal. So he's going right into, I guess, the third Fatima secret that has to do with Russia. And so I might abandon this right quick and do something else if this doesn't get better. He has some other webinars on here too, because we don't really care about the third Fatima secret because we don't believe in it. But from a Catholic perspective, um, let's see how they feel about it.
Audio, it should be set. All right. You should be able to see it now, and let me get it here.
I'll try to skip.
Doing well, and that their summer has been going by, pretty
Skip.
advancement of the ideology of communism into the Western world and the agitation that it caused. We continue this discussion in the present webinar, discussing the date of 1960 from Sister Lucia as our guiding light. Owing to its inherent atheism, communism has to efface faith in God and his revelation. Close to or at the top of a list of potential obstacles to this goal is the Catholic Church and the faith of all ages. It is in this regard that...
Well, faith of all ages. Yeah, I guess from a Catholic perspective, but no.
Sister Lucia's warning to Pius XII that we saw in the previous webinar, in her letter of June 1958 about communism reaching its high point, is particularly striking. She was essentially warning the Holy Father that we had not heard the last from communism. What was the high point of communism, and how did it manifest itself? That is most likely a question that people will debate for many years.
Why would we care about 1958
It seems to me that
when
Catholics
the
should
apparition
keep
was
in
in
mind
1917?
that the question has a dual dimension to it. There are the political or historical events from...
All right, skipping ahead. Sorry.
Knowledge of it in English didn't appear until mentioned Vatican II, sooner or later, the path of true aggiornamento. Rather, the true path was in remaining faithful to the received deposit of faith and bringing the deposit to modern man in terms that were more accessible. One can criticize the distinction herein implied by such an approach, but it seems necessary to be careful to read the distinction in accordance with the mind of John the 23rd and Paul the 6th. How well, however, would this path be received by those with a secular agenda, and moreover, by those influenced by people with this agenda? I think especially here of a general trend of thought, both then and
All
now.
right, not Fatima related, Vatican II related.
Leads to the
All right.
This discussion, we must wonder what struggles the popes underwent through such turbulent times. We shall pick up this discussion in the next installment. I'd like to now open up the floor for any comments that you may have.
Excellent. Very good presentation. I'm glad that you addressed some issues there with the Second Vatican Council. I'm sure that's going to ruffle some feathers.
Anytime you mention Vatican II, sooner or later, someone's going to get ticked off.
That's
There's
true.
There's no pleasing in all sides.
Yeah. It's true, though. I mean, that's been my observation. Yeah, y'all go ahead and send some chat questions. Make sure to send them to @Reason and Theology. Yeah, and by the way, very well done on the graphics. I was very impressed with that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I somebody sent about it in the chat room. Yeah, those were the pictures of the popes. Those they in my old seminary, they had a line of they call it the papal hallway there because they had all the pictures of different popes. So I took photos of them.
All right, we're going to skip a little, guys.
No, but as I understand, if you take a photo,
A lot of good stuff that you can find in the public domain. Yeah, but those are really good. I don't think we ever really.
Well, I've always kind of had a thing for Fatima. And I've always had an interest in private revelation in general. That's actually what a good chunk of my work has been in, is private revelation in general. But when I was working on my book, Pope Leo XIII and the Prayer to St. Michael, here, I'll just put it over. I was researching some stuff, and at the time, the Carmelites of Coimber's biography of Sister Lucia had just come out in October of 2013. But knowledge of it in English didn't appear until late summer of 2014, I believe. There was some controversy that popped up, and it news crossed over into the English-speaking world. So long story short, I was able to get a hold of chapter 13 of that biography in the Portuguese and work on an English translation. And I said, "Oh my goodness, this chapter answers so many questions." And essentially, it's what made my book on Fatima possible. It sparked an awful lot of interest within me, and I said, "You know what? This is good. I'm just gonna go for it." So I ran and ran and ran with it, and now, you know, that's just kind of how it happened. So it started developing um, roughly around 2014, 2015. But I had an interest in Fatima prior to that. As a matter of fact, in my private files, I have a photo of me sitting on a couch. I was young. I was like 17, 18 years old at the time. I had a full head of hair. Uh, I if and I'm sitting there and I'm reading something like 8.5 by 11 size.
What's this tattoo? Looks like a dragon tail or something like that.
Paper, and if you know what you're looking for, you can see it. I was actually reading something from Father Gruner in his Fatima Center, because I remember when that photo was taken. That's what I was reading, something from Father Gruner at the time, and that was about 97, 98. So this goes back a long ways. And then 2005, I was there on a pilgrimage, so in Fatima, before I went over to Italy. So it was very nice, and I really I just love Fatima. There's an awful lot to it. There's just how do I explain it? There's a lot there. So I'll just leave it there.
Now, you addressed the issue of aggiornamento, which of course is, updating, right? Something that you constantly hear about around the time of the Second Vatican Council, and you explained what it actually is, and instead of the misconceptions. I really appreciate you doing that, because there's definitely a lot of misconceptions there. Are you able to maybe expand on that a little bit, what you discussed there?
In terms of Fatima or in general?
Either. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on it.
All right. I think that we have to go with the attitude of Centere cum Ecclesia, thinking what to think with the church. And if we want to know what aggiornamento means, we have to understand it in accordance with the minds of the popes.
Yeah.
If there's one
This is much simpler than Sola Scriptura.
thing that Fatima tells us, is that there's going to be an awful lot of suffering for the Holy Father. Our Lady was very explicit. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. Mm-hmm. And so part of that suffering, I think, is people are not actually paying attention to the Pope. They're not listening. They kind of get ideas in their head. They misunderstand something, and then they run with their own interpretation. That's possible. Then there are some places where it may not be clear what the Holy Father meant, but there are processes in place to get clarifications. The old traditional understanding, that would be submitting a dubium or a dubia in the plural. And I know that's a hot button issue right now after the Cardinal's letter there regarding Amoris Laetitia. But I'm talking in terms of in the 20th century. So I think that a lot of things just got jumbled up. I really do. A lot of people, Pope Benedict was very explicit about this. There was the Council of the Media, or the Council of the Journalists, and then the Council of the Fathers. And he gave that beautiful address shortly before his abdication took effect in February 28th, I think it was, of 2013, in which he talked about these things fairly openly. And it was just really good to read. It was a breath of fresh air in many respects, because he basically says in so many words, the council divorced from the hermeneutic of faith is unintelligible. You won't understand it. But the journalists reported about it in these political terms of conservative versus liberal and all these other things. And that's what
hermeneutic of faith, hermeneutic of continuity, right? Yeah, like if you make it agree with the past, you'll find out that it agrees with the past.
Was getting leaked down in the media. Ironically, I remember when I was studying and reading and researching for my first book, Refractions of Light, I came across statements that John the 23rd had made to journalists towards the beginning of the council. And basically, he had said to them, my memory of this is like 13 years old, but he said something to the effect to the journalists that, remember, this is not your average everyday occurrence. You have to be careful with how you report on these things. So the buzzword was aggiornamento. that updating or that throwing open of the windows of the church, as some people also like to put it. I think even John the 23rd himself referred to it that way. Well, you know, there's a right way and a wrong way to understand this. And there are some people who viewed it outside of that hermeneutic of faith. They saw it in terms of liberal versus conservative, and it just warped the entire understanding of it.
I mean, they can't even tell you what Vatican II means, but they're going to rag on Sola Scriptura.
But communism had advanced so much in Marxist thought into the Western world, and had taken those errors of Russia, as Our Lady had simply put it, that people just didn't even think twice about this. Like, wait a minute, you know, liberal, conservative, that doesn't even fit in the church. The actual terms are closer to like what, heterodox and orthodox. But that's the actual term. Sometimes you may be a little bit in between if there's some debated or something's not as defined. You know, in other words, there's a gray area in which you can say, you know, it may not be defined by the church, or the jury's still
All right,
out. What we call the
skipping
theologumena,
because
the
we
debated
don't
thing.
care about Vatican II
But I do
as
know
much as we do about
that
Fatima.
the general attitudes surrounding Vatican II seem to just be stuck. And it's like, we got to progress here. So, for instance, you and I talked about the matter of
A couple questions here. This one is from Evan. Tricky topic. What credence do you think should be given to those who try to connect Fatima and the Bolsheviks, specifically in its alleged Jewish relations?
Oh my goodness, that's not tricky. That's just a cesspool. Well, if I'm understanding the question, if you wouldn't mind leaving it up so I can see it as I'm thinking about it. Alleged Jewish relations. I presume they are talking about the conspiracy theories that are rampant within the traditionalist communities about things like the Priory of Zion and document and all that. Protocols of the Elders of Zion, something like that. I presume that's kind of the general direction of where this is emanating from. Correct me if I'm wrong, dude. Is that kind of your interpretation too?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's easy to say Fatima and Bolshevism is certainly connected. Our Lady warned about the errors of Russia, and Bolshevism is certainly connected to that. Now, with respect to the alleged Jewish relations, that is a cesspool, absolute cesspool. Is it true historically that there have been some conspiracies among various Jews on certain matters? Yeah, I as I understand it, I think that's certainly a thing, but I don't really know if anybody has ever really written about it in this connection. You know, was this some kind of a Judeo-Masonic plot against the church with communism in order to destroy the Christian West? You know, I really, really don't think anybody's really done a good job on that. If can anybody even verify such a thing? I think it's kind of an.
All right, we're exiting out of that. We're going. I found an earlier one. Let's try to do that one. Sorry about that. Anyway, Vatican II is its own topic, which I'm not really doing right now. It's a useful foil. All right. Show the chat replay. I'll skip over the cello. Was that Our Lady of Guadalupe? Also mentioned my UFO video.
Dominus tecum, benedicta tu mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei.
To Jesus Christus. They were joined by Mr. Kevin Simmons. Kevin, how you doing, brother?
I'm doing all right. Bit early, but up and functioning.
Yeah, this is the best time we could squeeze you into both of our schedules. So Kevin Simmons is a Fatima scholar. He's written a book on the third part of the secret of Fatima. He also has a great book on the Saint Michael prayer with Leo the 13th. And he's done great research over the years. This book in particular is endorsed by two prestigious authors I know of. One is Robert Fastigi, prestigious scholar, editor of the recent Denziger. He's been on this show. And also Joseph Shaw over at the Latin Mass Society over in England. Good questions on Fatima. We're going to be trying to get at a general picture of where are the disputed questions and where are the undisputed questions. So, Kevin, first, have I gotten all your books? You've got 2 books, the St. Michael. Any other writings you'd like to draw attention to the viewers with?
Well, you got the St. Michael one, but also Refractions of Light.
Refractions of Light.
That was actually my first one.
Oh, what's that? Tell us about that book.
201 answers on apparitions, visions in the Catholic Church.
I might
so
need
it's
to get that.
It's quasi catechism like way where it's mostly all Q&A, and then a set of documents in the back that were translated from the original languages. Just basically talking about some of the fundamentals, the Church's theology of private revelation. What does the Church teach on this matter? What documents talk about it? What the one big document is the Church's norms from 1978. That forms a good chunk of what's looked at as well. But
I'm trying to get some book that goes over all the major Marian apparitions because I want to see how many connections there are, at least in official Catholic sources, to the paranormal. But from what I've seen with Fatima is that it's going to be hard. Things are going to be scrubbed and kind of interpreted in a Catholic lens. So hundreds of years or 100 years after the fact, we're lucky that there's contemporary reports from Fatima. So, but even Our Lady of Guadalupe vision, there was connections to fairy folklore and UFOs and that with the roses that or the flowers that disappear very upon touching. That's very common in paranormal circles. Is that some physical material that kind of goes away?
even some of the finer areas. So questions like, I went to X place of alleged apparitions and I'm now a priest because of it. So it must be true. Is that in fact the case? So those are some of the finer but also broader questions.
Well, that's really good information to have a basic foundation, because I think there's a lot of problems with the way just the common faithful may interact with these things. There's a lot of websites, as you know, which purport to be XYZ apparition, this and that, but are not necessarily approved or even promoted properly. So that sounds like a very good text to get into. So regarding Fatima, so what we're going to do is we're going to try to first nail down what are the undisputed parts of Fatima. And then Kevin is going to talk about what are the disputed points about Fatima. And if we have time, we'll also get into some other aspects, if possible, God willing. So in terms of undisputed aspects of Fatima, as I understand it, Kevin, the undisputed points seem to be, first of all, that there are very few people who really question the reality of Fatima. I think it seems that even...
Yeah, so if I chalk it up to the demonic, would that be, I guess that would include myself in not disputing the reality, quote unquote, of Fatima.
Among the so-called liberals in the Vatican, there's not a lot of people who question that even happened. But so it seems to be undisputed that it did happen, that there was a miracle of the sun. It's an approved apparition. It seems to be one of the most approved, most universal modern apparitions in terms of belief in general. But the basic message of Fatima of penance during World War One, that World War One is a punishment for sin, that there first needs to be penance regarding the Blessed Sacrament and the first apparitions with the angel. There needs to be
I think what he might be referring to is like a year prior to Fatima in 1915, 16, something like that. An angel appeared to the children. Granted, we mentioned the fourth child that was heard of or saw something, who was smart and just got the heck out of there. So that's mentioned by L.A. Marzulli, if you haven't watched our interview yet.
an offering of suffering, an acceptance of suffering in reparation for sinners to convert them.
Yeah, it's really weird when you read St. Lucia's autobiography. I guess from a Protestant perspective, it's very weird. And, you know, my American Catholic upbringing, which wasn't too devout, a lot of suffering for suffering's sake, but suffering as it's hard to describe. Suffering for the conversion of sinners, like these kids had to suffer. You know, suffering. It almost seems like their suffering wasn't in a biblical way. It's hard to say. It's not like fasting or something like that. It's just that they'd offer their suffering to Mary for the conversion of sinners. It was kind of creepy, to be honest. Not suffering like Paul suffered as he was moving the gospel along, or as a witness to others.
And the particular message, because that's still sort of a general message of general repentance that you can read in the scriptures, of course. But the particular message of Fatima is basically trying to avert World War II. So God is punishing the world. We need to repent. We need to expect, especially the devotions to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the consecration of Russia. And all of this is basically, we need to repent or else there will be a worse war. So it seems that that's the particular message of Fatima, which is more or less undisputed in terms of the basic facts of what happened and the message. So have I accurately described this, Kevin? Can you correct me where I've omitted anything or gotten anything wrong there?
For the most part, I'm with you on your description. The one thing that really jumps out at me is when you're saying you put a little too much emphasis upon World War II in the message of Fatima. The message of Fatima, yes, Our Lady predicts that another and worse war will break out during the pontificate of Pius XI. That is true, but it also goes a bit beyond that. It's not like everything kind of goes to World War II and then just halts. That kind of got that impression from how you were characterizing it, because that actually then gets in other questions with respect to the third part of the secret of Fatima that we'll get into, I think, a little bit later. Fatima encompasses a lot more. I think the onus that you placed on World War II more properly belongs to the errors of Russia and the penance that is necessary.
There was a lot in St. Lucia's memoirs about how, I forget how she kept phrasing it, but it's that their sins grieved Mary's heart. Things like, there was a lot of stuff like that. It was, again, very odd. I'd have to look up the exactness of that.
And amending of our lives that is necessary in the message of Fatima, I think, and the devotion to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. I think that's better where that onus belongs. But otherwise, yes, generally speaking, your description seems to be pretty good.
Okay, so can you tell me about more? Can you elaborate then on what are the bigger points that are beyond World War II? I guess that gets into the third secret. But what, before we get into that, any disputed questions of that, what are the undisputed aspects of where does Fatima go beyond World War II?
Well, for instance, Sister Lucia herself expressly stated, with respect to the third part of the secret, she wrote down that this can only be opened in 1960, Well, 1960 was 15 years after the end of World War II. So what's going on here? So just right there, that kind of tells us, that's a little time indicator right there, that there's something that continues on a little bit more into the future. And so I'm presently giving a series of webinars, and I get into this a little more deeply towards the end of the webinars. So I don't want to play my hand just reveal, tip my hand a little too much, but yeah, so I would just simply say that there's that indication in the literature of Fatima with that famous date of 1960, which tells us that there's more going on past World War II, or at least it kind of indicates that. Now, in my book, I do mention that there are some questions about how we understand that, but that's one of the finer points that we can kind of maybe get into a little bit more. With respect to the finer point is, did it mean that events up to then or events subsequent to 1960 would be, have something to do with this?
Don't trust any.
Yeah, but that's a very, very specific question as opposed to the broader.
I was just, while listening to them skimming through the book, there was a lot in the book, and checking my notes. St. Lucia is saying that Mary said devotion to her Immaculate Heart. I'm not an old school Catholic, so what is devotion to Mary's Immaculate Heart even mean? If a Catholic is in the chat, please let me know.
Outlines that we're painting right now.
Yeah, I forgot to, thank you for mentioning that. I forgot to mention that. So Kevin is doing a webinar on the 13th of every month, beginning last month on Our Lady of Fatima, and continuing on the 13th of June. Today, or this month, was on Reason and Theology. And I understand are you going to continue all the webinars on Reason and Theology for the future?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, excellent. So Kevin is presenting a lot of his research that some of it's not actually been released by him on these webinars. So this is very exclusive content. So make sure to go and subscribe to Reason and Theology. In my opinion, one of the greatest YouTube channels out there. So if you're not already subscribed to Reason Theology, please go subscribe. But it sounds like what you're saying is the undisputed aspect of Fatima, which goes beyond World War II and just reaches for really an indefinite period of time, is the errors of Russia. The errors of Russia are kind of everybody knows the errors of Russia are mentioned in the apparitions. It's undisputed. And that obviously goes
but
beyond
we're going with
World
it.
War II.
Let's just go with it.
Yes, very much so.
Right. So, and I know you reference in your book how Sister Lucia sent a letter to Pius XII and said that the reason for 1960 was that she thought that communism would be at its climax or apex in 1960. So she uses the Portuguese o ponto máximo, the high point, or as we would say in English, its zenith, or it's yeah. But she doesn't say that. She doesn't say in the year anno 1960. She uses in the era, era in Portuguese, of the 60s. So we would simply say in English either the 60s or the decade of the 1960s. That's kind of how she words it. Okay.
Well, my part is how she puts it. And it's a beautiful, beautiful letter that she wrote to His Holiness. But and it was only a few months before he died too. That was the kind of coincidental part of it. So she was essentially saying to the Holy Father, we have not seen the last of communism. And when you go back and you do some of the studies, like what I did in chapter 9 from my book on Fatima, you begin to see how this plays out a little bit more. And there was a particular insight that Cardinal Ottaviani had given in one of his own books that really helped me to see that connection and to ask some critical questions.
It's still around today.
So when you read that, when you read all of this in the night, but with the events of the historical events of the 1960s, a lot starts coming into place. And so I would encourage people to look at chapter 9 for more of the specifics on that.
Yeah, I recommend this book to everyone. It's a very excellent text with great research and excellent sources. So you've really done a great job with that. And I understand there might be a second edition in the future. Any status?
I hope so. Yes,
Okay.
Yes, I've gutted chapter 8, so that chapter 8 will be entirely new, and it's pretty meaty too. It's not going to be a lightweight chapter either. And the present materials in chapter 8 I relegated to another chapter. I can't remember which chapter number off the top of my head, but I've relegated that information to that chapter so that more room can be made for this new chapter 8.
Excellent. Okay. So, well, let me ask you one last question about an undisputed aspect of it, and then we can get into all these disputed questions. Are the errors of Russia understood as not only Soviet communism, but French communism, American progressivism, various forms of the same sort of Marxism? Is there a more general view of the errors of Russia, or is it sort of just Soviet communism?
That is one of the debates that's presently taking place among
Okay.
Fatima aficionados, is what exactly did Our Lady mean by the errors of Russia?
Okay.
In my opinion, I certainly think it refers to communism, Marxism especially, but the underlying atheism and materialism are areas that I really tend to focus on. I don't claim that those exhaust what Our Lady meant. Let me be clear on that point. But I think that for us to understand present events, we really should focus a little bit on atheism and materialism. But again, not to the exclusion of other insights that other scholars or researchers might offer and contribute to the discussion.
Okay. Yeah, it's very interesting because obviously Russia will spread her errors. Did happen with Soviet agents going all over the world and spreading Marxism, of course. But also there was sort of,
if we trust the third secret's legit, again,
more indigenous homegrown Marxism of a different brand, in just sort of liberalism and various things that were able to fit a little bit with certain Marxist ideas, especially sexual revolutionary ideas.
I wonder, I've seen a debate online with a Catholics debating Fatima with some atheists. I wonder if anybody from the Catholic perspective would be willing to discuss the connections with the paranormal, whether it's legitimate. Because I think from a Catholic perspective, what they would come down to is like, hey, something legitimate happened that is obviously not natural. So that means this was actually the Virgin Mary. Where we would come from the perspective of, or I come from the perspective of, this is most likely demonic based on messaging, things in the message, and connections to other things in the paranormal, especially UFOs. I mean, they said they saw a dull silvery disc with 3 people inside, 3 figures, which they said were the Holy Family, which they identified as Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus, which is just weird. Okay. And another thing that I mentioned in the interview was really weird in St. Lucia's memoirs was her saying, oh, and I saw this, and it's this Our Lady of place A versus Our Lady of place B. And I have no idea from a non-Catholic perspective, what is the difference between, how could you even tell apart? I guess it's iconography or something, whether a vision is Mary from here or Mary from there. So that I think might be worth going. I did find an interview with those the people who wrote the Fatima UFO books from the 70s, but it's in Portuguese. And I copied down the transcript for it, but it's all in Portuguese. And there's 78 pages of Portuguese text that I don't know. So where they did interact with Catholic priests, that would be amazing to have translated. So it was like a 70-some minute debate. And it's on YouTube. I found it on YouTube. God bless YouTube. You can find like Led Zeppelin bootlegs from all over the place. And you can find random Portuguese debates, but unfortunately I can't get a automatic translation on that one. So before we get back into this, I went to Catholic grade school pre-Vatican II. Mass was in Latin. Never knew what they were saying. Yep. Doesn't Fatima contradict the cessation of public revelation according to Rome? Seems like an apparent contradiction, so I'm almost certain they'd have an answer. So, based on earlier with this guy, I think it falls under private revelation to them. And Fatima, I think they've described as worthy of belief, but not I don't think Catholic is forced to believe in Fatima. Although most traditional Catholics, again, based on the obvious supernatural aspects of it, believe in Fatima. But they're not required to. All right.
Now, there's an interesting point that you made, I think, in your first webinar, which is where you pointed out that the interpretation of the third part of the secret given by the Holy See in 2000 is the idea of the third secret. We're not going to go through the text. I hope our viewers are familiar with the actual text, but if you're not, you can look up the message of Fatima just on the CDF. It's all right there on the Vatican's website. There you go. So the idea of the Pope and bishops and martyrs being killed was a vision, a symbolic vision. This is the interpretation of the Holy See, as I understand it. It's a symbolic vision of the entire 20th century in which the heirs of Russia are killing souls, especially in the symbolism of the arrows, but also killing bodies because they're also killing people physically as well. And then the attack on St. John Paul II is sort of just a culmination or sort of a one apex of that.
Was he shot by a communist?
As I understand it. So if I understood that interpretation properly in terms of the spread of Russia's errors?
Yeah, it seems like you fairly good representation. That's a point. I'm glad you raised this. Thank you. We need to stress this because in that first webinar, I really tried to focus, or in straight English, we'd say hammer. I was really trying to emphasize this point about what exactly was the interpretation of the Holy See of the images of this vision, because so many people have misunderstood what the Holy See has actually said. And I just quick explanation. Part of the reason why people have misunderstood is because when this book was published, The Message of Fatima, that has the text of the third part of the secret in it, which began on page 17, right here. A lot of people forgot, I guess might be the better word, or neglected, or however you want to put it, that there were actually two parts to the Vatican's presentation. This booklet was only one part. The other part was the questions and answers and the interventions that were given by Ratzinger, Tarcisia Bertone, and Dr. Joaquin Navarro-Valls, the Vatican Holy See spokesman. And so when you look at the total picture painted between these two parts, we begin to start, we're forced to ask questions about how people understood this. and a lot of people really, I'm sorry to say it, but they really botched it. They began to focus exclusively on the figure of the bishop dressed in white, saying that
I'm sorry, guys.
that
I need
this
to
was
skip
John
over
Paul's
see if there's
assassination
anything more
attempt that was
interesting,
shot
because
and killed and all this other stuff. And
this
I'm
is
just
my
like,
fault for not vetting
no,
this
that's
earlier,
not
but
quite how the Holy See said it. Cardinal Rat.
I don't really care about the third vision of what uh I don't really care what's going on in this third vision, because I think the third vision is from a demon. So
Ratzinger had a much
third
bigger
secret.
picture there.
Webinar that the Holy See sort of gave its
So we're gonna
interpretation,
skip
which is
and maybe skip
official,
back.
obviously, and is authoritative in some sense because it's obviously the Holy See saying it. But
Mhm.
nevertheless, the Holy See sort of left room for other interpretations. Can you explain and break down how that works in terms of
All right, blah blah blah.
or not? You debated Christopher Ferrara a couple years ago at an Angelus press conference in which you debated that very question of, and people can go and buy that debate, the audio.
Hold on a second.
I understand it.
Let's skip back.
And you say you promise that you'll pay me back. I have reasonable hope and trust, dare I say faith, that what you say is true. Or if you tell me something that you saw on the news, I have reasonable human faith that you're not lying to me, unless I have reason to believe otherwise. So that's kind of the general distinction. And the church says we believe, or people are allowed to believe in various private revelations that have been approved by the church on the level of human faith. We are not required to believe in it in order to be
There you go,
Catholics
Paul.
in good standing. And that includes Fatima. There have been some discussions about that, actually, but I don't agree with those who hold the opinion that Fatima is a part of divine revelation, let's say, and that we have to assent to Fatima. I don't agree with that position. And I mean that with all due respect, but there's been some debates on that. So those are the general levels and the distinctions that are in play here.
Yeah, I'm surprised that anyone would assert that it's a part of divine revelation. That would seem to be some strange form of modernism adding to the deposit of faith. But that's
Well, it's not a stupid question, because you have Mary coming down from heaven as an apparition or something, and communicating with children to deliver messages that eventually get to the Pope. So could you see how people could be confused that that's revelation?
let's just set
Well,
that
no,
aside
it's
for now.
not so much adding, but the argument is that Fatima, they say, was predicted in divine revelation, and so when it happened, it was a fulfillment of one of the prophecies in divine revelation. So that's the argument that I have seen advanced.
Okay,
I personally
that's
don't
more
agree with
reasonable, at least. Okay, now let's get into what are the disputed questions about Fatima. As I understand it, as you already pointed out, perhaps the first one we should discuss is the errors of Russia and what are they? Are they Soviet communism? Are they Marxism in general? Are they liberalism? But besides that, the errors of Russia, the other big disputed questions are the consecration of Russia. Did it happen on Pius XII? Did it happen under John Paul II? Has it not happened at all? And the third part of the secret, obviously, as you've dealt with a lot, which is has it been fully revealed in 2000 or not? You debated Christopher Ferrara a couple years ago at an Angelus press conference in which you debated that very question and people can go and buy that debate.
So long story short, taking my friend's insight with Frere Michel with the translation issues, context determines meaning. So it was translated, Novissimi was translated into Frere Michel's French text as Le Dernier Temps, the last times. Not the last things, but the last.
All right.
Of suspicion and conspiracy. You're going to be automatically distrustful of what people say Lucia said with respect to church authority, ecclesiastical authorities. And in the case
this
that
might
you're
be good.
talking about, the church of trustful of all the
or not counting them as they should, missing. And so what are the question is there an issue with the use of Sister Lucia's words? Because in that controversy in 57, they actually quoted Sister Lucia in the dispute, but that also was not enough. And so what are the would you say that there is a long-standing tradition of dismissing the words of Sister Lucia or not counting them as they should?
Well, let's see. It just depends upon where you start, what your vantage point is. If you approach it from what I call the hermeneutic of suspicion and conspiracy, you're going to be automatically distrustful of what people say Lucia said with respect to church authority, ecclesiastical authorities. And in the case that you're talking about, I believe you're referring to the Father Fuentes interview. Right. Okay. Perhaps.
All right. So should we trust what has been communicated to us is the third secret of Fatima?
I should give some quick context for people on that. Father Agustin Fuentes was the postulator, the vice postulator for the causes of Jacinto and Francisco Manto, the young visionaries from Fatima who had passed away very early on. And he was able to meet with Sister Lucia in December of 1957, I believe it was. Sometime later, he then gave a conference to a group of nuns, I think in Mexico, and he relayed some of the conversation that he had with Sister Lucia and some of the things that he says that she said. But then he also published these remarks in his own publication called, and forgive me if my pronunciation is horrible, I think it's Hacia los Altares, and which was Fuentes' own publication. He had a little cottage industry going there. He published these remarks attributing things to Sister Lucia. First published in Spanish, then it was published in English in the publication called Fatima Findings, a copy of which I have somewhere here in my files, by a Father Ryan in Baltimore area, I think, or someone through there, Maryland. Well, that English translation was then translated into Portuguese by a publication called A Voz, and it went viral around Portugal, and it created such a brouhaha that the Diocese of Coimbra, where Sister Lucia lived at the time, someone went to her, and if I remember correctly, I think it was the bishop himself, went to Coimbra and asked her about this. Well, she likely saw the Portuguese translation, which itself was based upon the English, which itself was based upon who knows what. And she's like, I didn't say this. This isn't true. So the Diocese of Coimbra published a warning, like a notification saying that's Fuentes is not accurate here. This is not what he's saying, things that she's denying, and here's her exact statement. Subsequent people have said that statement was forced from her. It was plied out of her or something to that effect. There's no evidence to support that.
Okay.
But it led to a big brouhaha, which is continuing even to this day, even in the chat room here that I see, because I have pulled up here.
Well, if Catholics are willing to cover over sexual abuse to protect the church, is it outside of the realm of possibility that they'd lie about third secrets of Fatima? I mean, really? All right, skipping around.
Left. I'm not in a position to argue Sister Lucia. I mean, I'm not as well versed on matters of the questions of the consecration of Russia as I am, say, the third part of the secret of Fatima. But we have her imprint. There's video of her online, like on a camera, saying much the same of what she just said here, and I just read in this book. So, because people don't feel as though they can just trust what the church says.
Yeah,
What's that old saying? Trust but verify. I happen to be a big proponent of that idea, actually. Well, that's what I did. But I reasonably trusted people. But
all right, skipping through,
that
we're probably
command.
end early.
She didn't want to reveal that Our Lady had appeared to her. And Bertone did not ask her, did Our Lady appear to you? Is it Our Lady who fixed that date? That he and others advance are quickly becoming very outdated because they are deeply rooted in old information that doesn't take into consideration that the documents are this ever increasing pool of knowledge of our and facts of what we know about Fatima, especially after Lucia's death. So the point here is we know that Lucia was circumspect about her mystical experiences. In my book, chapter 4, I refer to it in terms of her being truthful yet evasive. And that's a key point in her life, in her spiritual life, in her character. And so we have to take this seriously, and she was very measured in her statements. So, for instance, chapter 4 of my book talks about the contradiction. Somebody in the chat earlier, said, please show something to the effect of, please show how the interior consistency of Fatima matches with the official narrative. Okay. Well, that itself is a good question related to this one. Then Archbishop Bertone talked to Sister Lucia, and he asked her point blank, why that year of 1960 on the date of the envelope? Was it Our Lady who fixed that date? Well, Lucia very explicitly said to him, according to Bertone's words, she said, no, it wasn't Our Lady, it was I who fixed that date, because I had this intuition that it would be better understood. Well, that flies right in the face of everything we've ever known. And that was one thing that was a legitimate question advanced by Christopher Ferrara and other people. Exact apparition in 1944 and more of those details. So how you phrase the question. It's all in how you phrase the question. So however the question was phrased to her, however it was then translated by the Bishop of Fatima, Bishop Seraphim, to her into Portuguese. You see what I'm doing here? You see what's happening here? Telephone game in a way. By the time it gets back to Bertone, through whatever channels, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anybody, I'm just saying these are the facts. We have reason to believe that, or to question that, because Lucia was a subtle person, I think that what happened was there was something lost in translation, as it were, and I think that she only answered the specific question as she understood it without wanting to reveal Our Lady's exact apparition in 1944 and more of those details. So she answered truthfully, yet evasively. And so all the specifics of how that works are in chapter 4 of my book. So I think it's possible to reconcile things when you look at it from that perspective. I even have an article about it on my website.
Yeah, I think that's, to me, I think that's a very plausible explanation, because it does show a very saintly character, because there's almost a shame. I don't know if you'd call it shame, but there's sort of an embarrassment. I remember reading, I think, in the life of St. Anthony, where they're embarrassed about, if they're fasting or doing some holy practice that people might think is holy. They're embarrassed. They don't want to show people. They're they want to be totally hidden. So, when a saint has an apparition, they want to hide it and be totally hidden. When a saint has stigmata, they want to be totally hidden because they want to offer it to Jesus Christ alone and hate the praises of men. So this is a very saintly thing of all saints to do. Now we've got about 10 more minutes. Excuse me.
Well, just real quick, I want to make a quick analogy. There was a movie made by Leonardo de Philippis about St. John of the Cross. And there's a very poignant scene where John of the Cross was in prison.
All right.
He gets out.
Let's move some
And
more.
he goes, I had to make known to the Archbishop
All right,
of
I think that's
Valladolid,
I'm
by
in
order of
right.
His Excellency, a little request of
guys.
our Lord to the bishops of Spain, and
God bless.
another to